This is a recording of Sprout Lab's Trends in Digital Learning that Improves Results webinar. It's not a live recording. What we do is I do a recording afterwards of the bits where I talk, and then I also do a summary of the interactive sections as well. This is one reason why quite often the webinars run for an hour, but in actual fact the recordings are really only about 60 minutes long. So to start with, a little bit about what Sprout Labs does. We work with organizations to design learning ecosystems that accelerate expertise. So we work with sort of blended learning in the 70-20-10 model, and quite often also work with complex skills and knowledge. We work across 4 different areas: strategy, doing design and development work around blended learning, and then working with technologies like Tatara and Tatara Social and Glasshouse to support those sorts of complicated blends as well. And because these sort of things don't just happen, we also help organizations implement these programs afterwards. What I'll be discussing today is rethinking compliance training, digital learning in the 70-20-10 learning model, and the application of design thinking to learning. Some new approaches about digital learning and the effect of those, and then also a little bit around tracking and recording. The next webinar is going to be focused on digital learning in the 70-20-10 learning model and ecosystems, so haven't probably gone into that as much as what I was expecting to when I wrote the summary. We started with this exercise that really worked from a little bit of a negative, but it was about really why the results weren't what you expected from digital learning. So I'll just refer back to my notes from the screen grabs. Some of the themes that were really strong that came up when people did this exercise were poorly designed courses, and too long and too content heavy, and really boring and not interactive. A couple of really interesting insights were it's actually difficult to get results from learning full stop. It might not just be e-learning, it's just actually hard to actually get results from learning, and that's something we probably need to think quite a lot about. And one of the reasons for this is we don't always think about integration and lack of how these things are integrated into offline things as well. So meet Rebecca if you haven't met her before. She's my fictional L&D person. So we're going to be following her through a number of challenges and a number of things she's doing in her business at the moment during the webinar. And one of the things that she wants to do is really start to shift her employees' mindset around compliance. This is actually something that's not just her who's wanting to do it. It's quite a common thing that's being talked about now, to really go beyond compliance to being about a tick and flick thing, and really start to work on people's mindset around working in ethical and safe ways, especially around compliance, because they are some of the areas that we quite often have to redo compliance repeatedly in Australia. Just a little bit of background. E-learning and digital learning has really been sold on being cheaper and faster, especially around compliance training. I actually think this has driven us to a spot where we're actually not getting the results from it, because it's actually quite often put together in the cheapest possible way. And at the same time as this, what's also happening is it's been very organizational centric. It's been focused on tracking and completions, and been sold in terms of being records that protect the organization. There hasn't been a lot of thinking really around, well, what does this mean for our employees and learners? How does this really shift people's mindsets? About a year ago, we actually decided we weren't doing any more compliance training because of this shift, and because of this thing that was really getting low-level results, and the drivers were to do with cost reduction only, not quality learning outcomes. Then had a really interesting conversation with a safety provider who was a consultant as well as trainer, and they actually, I said this outrightly, that we actually don't do compliance training, and they turned around and said, well, we don't do compliance training. We help people develop the capacity to manage risk in a rich way. So actually start to explore this a little bit more with them, and really what they do and how they go about doing this. And it's really a rich approach that's based on personal leadership. It's really about making people shift their mindsets through understanding at a deep personal level why they need to behave in certain ways and what that means to them. This really needs to be worked in a way where it's actually beyond just a short e-learning module. It needs to have a blended approach. It sometimes includes real measurements around competency and capability in the workplace as well. Now I open this up to, sorry, just one more slide. Then the other thing is a lot of compliance training has to have reaccreditation, and there's two things that are really starting to happen: is reaccreditation through assessment-only pathways, so people are being assessed rather than having to be retrained every year, and then also using this reaccreditation process as an opportunity to practice skills and practice things around complex scenarios and branching scenarios that people might not normally be in a spot that they'll be able to work with and explore problems in the workplace. And also, we've worked with a number of organisations that have tried to then use these opportunities for reaccreditation to embed other value-based skills and other types of skills into the process as well. Opened up to the group about what other approaches they've seen work well in compliance training. A few people talked about that thing that I just mentioned around compliance being measured by competency and capability, and measuring through coaching and on-the-job assessments, and job shadowing as part of that. A few other people talked about going the next step after what I just talked about with the reassessment processes. I've actually then starting to work with adaptive learning. So if people had gaps in their learning from the assessment, they would just be shown those sections. There was also some nice ideas around taking it out of being just a learning thing and putting it and giving team leaders and people managers discussions and prompts to be able to work with topics in team meetings as well. Back to Rebecca. So one of the things she's wanting to do is really improve how she wants to use digital learning and really start to think about integrating the 70-20-10 learning model into that. What she's really probably talking about is a how. Digital learning is really a how you learn. It's actually a learning method, and it's also 70-20-10 is a how you learn as well. So really what she's talking about is reworking and rethinking and developing sophisticated learning design frameworks that really help define how learning is designed and delivered in organizations. As this is happening, we're seeing people embed sort of principles around what these sort of learning design frameworks need to look like, and then developing toolkits to help people design and develop those in a consistent way as well. So it's becoming a shared language for everyone in an organization. There's also a general talk, and not just from Sprout Labs, around designing 70-20-10 ecosystems, things that work beyond just programs and thinking about things in a more holistic way. The framework we sort of work with around designing ecosystems at the moment, and it's always evolving, is at the center you have this notion of that you need guides. And these guides might be competencies, capability frameworks, but they're things that give people structure to where they need to be and how they need to be measuring what they're doing. This is supported by making sure you have the right knowledge systems in place so people can access the information when they need it, so the training isn't actually full of information. Then the actual learning experiences become spots for practicing new skills and getting feedback quickly, and really being able to do really deliberate practice to be able to develop expertise. Wrapped around all of this is as a support of peers and each other's managers, and especially a real focus on managers' roles in learning as well. So one of the things Rebecca's found is that applying design thinking, especially to her compliance training, has really made her rethink and her organisation rethink what they need to do with their learners to be able to create real change. Design thinking is not a new term. It's becoming very commonly used as a process and a term in Australia at the moment. Essentially what it is about applying the same principles that designers use to other business processes and practices. So it's about taking a sort of analytical and creative approach that product designers, graphic designers use, and then applying that to the development of products and services in organizations. What we're seeing is organizations are using this in their product and service design areas and their marketing areas, and then starting to want their internal business areas like HR, finance, L&D to start to adopt the same processes. The end result is quite often learner-centered processes that are and programs that are really innovative to meet the needs of people in new ways. So design thinking is also two things. It's both a process and a mindset. And I'll talk quickly about the process first. It's essentially, we talk about it as this 5-step process. People have different words for different stages, but the first stage is really starting to develop a real deep understanding of who your learners are, what their motivations are, and how they work, and then, and quite often the outcomes of those are personas, characters that are given names, given specific ages. They have, and you start to build a sort of empathetic understanding of those people, and then you develop stories that sit there and says Anna needs such and such from this learning experience, or John needs such and such. You then do a stage which is an exploring stage. We call it exploring. Some other people call it ideation, but it's really about sort of thinking through, quite often with a group of people, about what could be the possible solutions that might end up in that sort of understanding phase. If you develop that sort of deep understanding, you can sit there and possibly build solutions for learners that are actually integrated into the flow really nicely. A really good example of this is a L&D person I've been talking to recently found that in actual fact the spot where people wanted to know about their project management practices and project management wisdom was really in their project management system. So what they did was add a button on certain screens where they'd be able to open up a screen and then talk through and see what is best practice, tips and tricks for not just using the software, but actually what they're doing in that particular stage of delivering the project. So that came from actually a deep understanding and then coming up with different new ideas about how to work that. Then the next stage is, rather than the waiting and going through a whole complicated process of developing detailed documents, you start prototyping quickly. And especially in 70-20-10 models, they're not always easy to prototype. Quite easy to prototype them like an e-learning module, because in actual fact you can do screen grabs. 70-20-10 models have more elements to them. There's a whole discipline called service design, and in some ways blended learning and 70-20-10 models based on 70-20-10 are more like service design. And service design use stories a lot and maps to map out the experiences as well. These prototypes are then tested rapidly with your end learners, not just your stakeholders, your actual learners. You go back out, show them, get opinions, learn from them, loop back over, and then prototype. And then in some ways, this testing and evolving stage starts to mix together, because in actual fact, you start to sort of build, evolve, and some of the best clients we're working with are in a spot where they're always evolving and always continually improving. Now, some people have actually sat there and said, Robin, you've got no implementation phase. And that's because in some ways, this whole prototyping, testing, evolving becomes a build and implementation phase that all happens concurrently very quickly. The key to this is actually, I think, being in the shoes of the learner, taking yourself out of your own space and developing a really empathetic understanding for what it means to be the learners. Now, before I said that in actual fact that it was both a process and a mindset, in this particular table, which I'm not going to read out, and hopefully on the recording is clear enough for everyone to see, is really a summary of what that mindset means in terms of learning and development. It's really the notion that the mindset is really about being learner-centered, coming up with new ideas, working in an iterative way. It's actually driven by being collaborative as well, and learning as you're going through the process. Now, just quickly, what I did was put back out to the group about barriers to design thinking in L&D teams. The first person put up something that was really exciting. None. We're using this in our L&D team already, which was exciting to hear. But some of the other barriers people sort of talked about was feeling uncomfortable about getting into that empathy phase and what questions to ask. And then also feeling nervous about the fact that there's possibly not a really set things worth of design requirements. One thing sometimes we've actually done is after that prototyping phase, actually build design blueprints that are based on the prototype, so that then they can be sort of more locked into place as well. There's sometimes a little bit of fear because this is a real unknown, and people sometimes are unwilling to collaborate. They just want a simple solution. They want a tick and flick thing. They want to give someone the content, and they just turn it into an e-learning module. And all of a sudden, people want to do a process where they want to work together, and they just want something that's more transactional. They're probably not going to get the business result from that, but they think that they're going to get a cheaper, easier way of doing things. Now, this process for Rebecca has also meant that they're changing the way they're authoring their digital learning as well, specifically around collaboration. And digital learning by its nature is actually collaborative. It's a process that involves multiple types of experts, instructional designers, writers sometimes separate from the instructional designers, different types of designers who actually some might be specialists in user interface design, some might be specialists in instructional design, and it works in a collaborative environment. And the way to really enable this collaborative environment is working with cloud authoring systems. There's been a rapid growth and rapid advancement of the ones that are on the market. And two that I'm just going to quickly talk about is Adapt and the Adapt Builder, which is a fully HTML5 version. We've actually at Sprout Labs developed our own over a period of time for a couple of reasons that really allows for a really different way of authoring. We've found repeatedly it increases collaboration, but at the same time making sure people are all working within the same system. It's faster, increases agility. You don't have to change something. You just go into the content management system and you change the words. You don't have to go through a process of building it, opening it, captivating, exporting it, uploading it, then getting someone else to check it. And specifically that process I just talked about of doing the reviews are just so much easier. Many of these tools have sort of inbuilt commenting systems where you can just very simply drag across something and be able to comment directly on it. Rebecca's also finding in her organisation this is actually meaning that they can storyboard directly into their systems. Now, this particular trend has some pros and cons. We're finding it's really making us focus on what we do before we start storyboarding, and realizing that storyboarding is really just a design document at the end of a process, and so much more goes into the actual instructional design process. It also means quite often what we're finding is that process is being actually a bit more fluid at the same time. The consequence and the con of it means that instructional designers have to be closer to the tool that they're using and spend more time working around the constraints of the tool rather than sometimes just designing learning. Rebecca's also finding that everyone expects everything to work on mobile devices. It's really common as we surf the web, for everything to work seamlessly across different devices. The best solution to this that we're seeing is responsive web design techniques. If you're not familiar with the idea of responsive web design techniques, I'll just show you some examples. On the right-hand side, we've got a sort of map-style interface with numbers, and then when that sort of gets viewed on a smaller screen of a mobile device, the actual interface for that changes and turns into a list that's a whole lot easier to be able to click on a mobile device. This means that you're only designing the resource once and you're outputting it, and it's natural. You're not outputting it in different versions. It's naturally just sort of responding to how it's being viewed. The thing that's a bit challenging is good e-learning should be a lot more interactive than what most of the web is. Most of the web is content. It's actually images, text, video. It doesn't have the complicated interactions that we deal with in digital learning. Digital learning and making digital learning responsive is a lot more like making a full complicated web app responsive, and some people don't accept that complexity. Just to mention it quickly, Rebecca's also finding that her learners really want shorter experiences, and this was one of the things that people talked about with not getting results from e-learning at the beginning thing, was that sense that most e-learning is quite often just too long, too boring. So there's a real tendency and a real move towards micro-learning and smaller learning interactions. And really, if you can do that sort of thinking through what are the needs of the learner, you can sometimes get the micro-learning experience into being the right time frame. One of the nicest examples I've seen is in GP training, to sit there and go, well, if we make this into a chunk of 5 minutes, that means if a patient doesn't turn up for a session, a GP might be able to jump into a micro-learning experience and just access that for 5 minutes, get something out of it, and then move on to the next patient. Now, did a quick interaction around what does an overhead projector have to do with most e-learning. And it was just to break things up a little bit. And it was very clear. People who actually made the comment and got it very quickly. Most e-learning is really based on a slideshow format. And I sort of think this is meaning that we're actually basing our e-learning on an outdated idea that was to do with overhead projectors. Overhead projectors got turned into PowerPoints. Then our e-learning has been sort of sold around the tools about converting from PowerPoint, making it easy for a face-to-face trainer to move online, not really thinking about, well, how do most people interact with the web? And most people interact with the web not by clicking a next button, they scroll down a page. I firmly believe the future of digital learning is scrolling pages. They're easier interface for people to use, they're easier to design with, and they make the responsive learning process a whole lot easier. So what they really mean is, in terms of responsive learning, that's really a lot more comfortable for someone to be able to scroll up and down on a mobile device. Rebecca's like many people her learners hate her learning management system. They hate having to redo their compliance compliance modules every year, and they're associated with boredom. It's a growing trend that we've seen is people are starting to work beyond the learning management systems. One of the things that quite surprises me is now we've seen a number of organisations put in second platforms. They might have what we call a first generation LMS that's almost a SCORM player that's really good at tracking compliance, and they leave that in place and sit there and go, actually, that's going to be our compliance platform, and then they put in a platform that's more modern, that's better suited for blended learning and face-to-face, blended learning and social learning, and manages face-to-face learning better, and they build that as their more learner-centered experience and keep the other one as their organizational-centered experience. The other trend is to really actually sit there and go, well, we're going to start working with things that are not normally used for learning technologies. So things like building portal, using tools like WordPress, Silverstripe, and SharePoint. And these are really, and these sorts of things are based on web design practices, less so than the slide-based world. These sorts of things are also able to quite often have really simple interactions in them as well. So Silverstripe, I'm mentioning that because that's actually what we've built Glasshouse on top of, and we actually have a full range of really sophisticated interactions in that. The couple of organisations we talked around who are doing around WordPress, they've been able to get to the spot very quickly that they've got things like basic multiple choice questions and short answer questions happening. The question that quite often happens is people sit there and go, well, but what about tracking? And there's a really interesting trend. 3 things we've seen happen around tracking is assessments are put into the learning management system so they can still be tracked. This is also one of those areas where people sit there and go, this is a perfect example of what could be Experience API could be used for. In practice, we're not seeing people use that so much. Google Analytics actually gives people a lot of what they need in terms of tracking to be able to understand, well, what sections of the resources are people using, how people are generally navigating it through it. And if it's not for compliance, it also means that people are not having to track that completion so much. The interesting thing is it does also make people focus on tracking outcomes. So sitting there going, well, actually our end result is for the stores to have more sales after this resource has been put into place, after the portal has been put into place, what's been the effect on our sales? And this also makes them rethink and put in other different types of things around the edge to possibly make that happen as well. Did a quick exercise at the end of the session about how VR could be used in learning and development. 2016 has been called the year of virtual reality. Virtual reality technology has been around for a little while, and it's really the year that's possibly becoming a whole lot more accessible. So devices and headsets are actually cheaper. It's cheaper to author with, especially virtual reality systems that are based around video. And some of the things that came back with, I'm amazed. I'm keen on exploring gamification and online virtual interactions. Someone said, yes, we're using it already. And a few other people sort of worried a little bit around the cost involved. And the other one is, and a few people brought it up, is that the people who might not want to work as part of simulations or role plays in face-to-face situations, they might be really happy to work with role plays in an virtual environment. Now that brings me to the end of the recording. Thank you everyone for watching and listening to this. If you've got any questions or you want to have any discussions about some of these ideas and some of the practices or technologies that I've talked about today, give me a hi. You've probably got my email address if you're getting this particular webinar recording. Just reply and start up a conversation. Thank you very much.